My opponents profess to be, or at least have been widely described, as representatives of something called the new atheism. Yet I have to point out that the kind of reasoning on display here is not only entirely familiar to me, but of a particular kind that even I, during my own years as an atheist, could not in all intellectual conscience endorse. Perhaps we'd better examine it.
Oh yes, I've heard that all too often. I used to be an atheist, but it's the oldest trick in the book.
Perhaps we ought to bring this conversation back to the matter of evidence.
Hello, this is Brian Otten of Apologetics 315. Today's interview is with Peter S. Williams. Peter is a Christian philosopher, apologist, and author. He's written a few books that I very highly recommend, including The Skeptic's Guide to Atheism and Understanding Jesus, 5 Ways to Spiritual Enlightenment. Today, I'll be talking to Peter about his latest book, C.S. Lewis versus the New Atheists. Well, thanks for joining me again for an interview, Peter.
Oh, thank you, Brian. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, Peter, this is our third interview now, and we've talked before about some of your books and your work. But today we'll be talking about your latest book, which is C.S. Lewis versus the New Atheists. But I wonder, just as we get started, what's been keeping you busy these days since our last interview?
Well, writing this book and another book that's coming out later this year has kept me quite busy. I've got a Christian philosophy textbook, an introduction to philosophy, that's written from an explicitly Christian viewpoint, and that's coming out in the summer. And I've also been getting into doing a bit more debating. So a couple of weeks ago I was at Cardiff University debating a philosopher from the philosophy department there called Christopher Norris at a meeting organised by the Atheist Society and the Christian Union at the university. And indeed tomorrow I'm off to Premier Christian Radio in London, where I should be recording a programme talking with A.C. Grayling about his latest book.
Well, phenomenal. I'm looking forward to hearing some of those debates as well as reading this new book. For this interview, we'll be talking about C.S. Lewis versus the New Atheists. So, I know that there's been a number of Lewis books that have come out, but what's the goal of this book?
Well, there's a lot of books coming out, I think, particularly because it's the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death this year. So Lewis died in November of 1963. And there's various sort of celebratory events happening this year, and people bringing out books. Now, Alistair McGrath has got a new biography of Lewis coming out this year. But mine is both a celebration of Lewis and a defamation, if you like, of the new atheism, putting them into debate with one another, in a sense. Various new atheists in their books mention Lewis. They mention him enough that one would think they owe him some serious engagement, which they don't really deliver on. But I found Lewis was an interesting dialogue partner to the new atheism, in part because of the Oxford connection. A lot of today's new atheist writers, like Richard Dawkins and Anthony Grayling and so on, studied at Oxford, got their doctorates at Oxford, supervised by professors at Oxford who would have been colleagues of C.S. Lewis's at his day in Oxford. They're only one sort of intellectual generation removed from the Oxford of Lewis's day. And, of course, Lewis was an atheist at Oxford when he went through his undergraduate training there, when he was initially a professor there. And I look into Lewis's views that he held as an atheist to see where they're in some ways strikingly similar to views held by new atheists, and in some very crucial ways different.
Well, excellent. Very a unique approach, quite different than maybe what you're going to see with just biographies or, the different books that sort of explore the themes of his work. the approach that you take, are you exploring Lewis's own journey from atheism to theism and then sort of answering the new atheists as they've sort of presented their cases but sort of ignored what Lewis has really said about this? In essence, I'm thinking, does this book sort of put them in their place and they didn't realize it?
That puts it in a nutshell, really, yes. So I look at what were Lewis's views as an atheist, and then not only at what were the arguments that made him change his mind about that, but why was it that he took thinking about arguments for the existence of God, say, seriously, in a way that today's neo-atheist writers clearly don't take thinking about philosophical arguments for the existence of God terribly seriously at all. Why is it that Lewis engaged with those arguments and allowed them to change his mind on the issue, whereas neo-atheist writers interact in a very desultory manner with the metaphysical arguments for God that changed Lewis's mind?
Well, in a way, sometimes when I hear the new atheists speak about Lewis or his writings, it's almost a hand-waving sort of attitude from some of them where it seems like liar, lunatic, Lord, that's been defeated. And then they just hand-wave it without maybe treating it with the respect or the depth of treatment that they should. And I'm wondering, as you're exploring these themes in the book, what particular arguments from Lewis do you tend to bring out that maybe that the new atheists have kind of neglected?
Sure, that's a good question. The arguments that I look at include what's been called his the argument from desire, what he talks about as joy in his autobiography. It's a sort of existential, partly ascetic kind of argument from human desire for God or for things that only God could give us. God would be a precondition of us achieving. I look at the argument from reason, as particularly famously put by Lewis in his book Miracles. I look at the moral argument. Lewis gave that particularly famously in Mere Christianity. And I look at the background to his consideration of that argument in, for example, W.R. Fawley's Gifford Lectures on that theme that we know Lewis read. And then I do look at Lewis's interaction with the evidence for Jesus and particularly at how the new atheists, as you say, want to try and dismiss the lunatic liar Lord argument. And of all of Lewis's argument, that's the one that they actually spend the most time interacting with, but not sufficiently grappling with to show that Lewis was wrong about that. They tend to, Christopher Hitchens, for example, sort of hand waves and says, it's a sort of false dilemma. There are other options, but he doesn't actually pick one. And he sort of flip-flops, and sometimes it seems he wants to say, oh, okay, Jesus was bad, or sometimes he wants to say, oh, no, he was a madman. Generally, he wants to say, it's very doubtful that Jesus even existed anyway, so the whole thing doesn't get off the ground, which is a very extreme position to take on the historical Jesus. Richard Dawkins, I think, really hammers home how strong the lunatic liar Lord argument is when he says, well, obviously there's another option that Lewis didn't consider, and that is that Jesus was just honestly mistaken. Plenty of people are honestly mistaken about things all the time. I think the wittiest response to that I've heard is from Nicky Gumbel, famous from the Alpha Course. Nicky Gumbel says that the strange thing about the God delusion, Dawkins' book, is he says Christians are deluded for believing that there's a God, but that Jesus wasn't deluded even though he thought he was God.
That's classic. Well, yeah, I really would like to dig into maybe one or two of these topics. Yeah. But as you mentioned, it's sort of the 50-year anniversary of Lewis. Talk about just a moment, before we get into that, when we look at his life and his writings and his work, how would you describe his impact on Christianity and Christian apologetics overall in light of, that anniversary?
Yeah, very, very strong. I think people are right to say he's probably the foremost Christian apologist in terms of impact, at the popular level at least, in the 20th century. You'd probably mention C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer and maybe a handful of other names, but I think Lewis would be at the top of the list there. For multiple reasons, really. I think part of it was that he was simply a very good writer. And you can go to Lewis to pick up a lot about how to actually write good, communicative prose. The fact that he had a very sort of holistic approach to issues. He didn't divide faith from either reason or from the sort of ascetic, artistic imagination. And that he was someone who was capable of writing really well, both at the sort of discursive, polemical essay on the one hand, or writing a fantasy novel or a science fiction book or an allegory or some poetry on the other hand, so that he really sort of covered the waterfront in terms of the sort of artistic communication, the rhetorical communication of the truths that he wanted to communicate across a range of styles. And, that's certainly something to aspire to in our communication of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Your book deals with how Lewis answers the new atheists, so to speak, but still thinking about Lewis's impact, as you say, it's undoubtedly he's so influential, but at the same time, I've heard or you can kind of see a little bit of polarization amongst Christians themselves, where they would say some would just love him and some would not love him at all. Maybe saying something along the lines of, well, he just argues for mere Christianity. That's not good enough. And so I wonder maybe if you'd speak to that element a bit about his approach. And, it was very influential and some would argue very effective, but some would say, that's not the way to go. What are your thoughts on mere Christianity, so to speak?
Yeah, well, certainly the fact that Lewis focused on what he famously called mere Christianity has in itself been a great uniting force for Christians across different traditions. So Lewis is beloved by members of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches as well, and they find something to share in that love of the mere Christianity that Lewis focused on. But I think it would be important to point out that Lewis himself would have pointed out that mere Christianity is not enough. He talks about introducing mere Christianity as sort of the hallway or the lobby of Christianity that's important to people to get into, but you don't want to live in the hallway. You'd want to pick a particular church or something, but that he didn't feel it was his place or calling to enter into those sort of inter-Christian debates. That he saw his calling as has been called, I think by Time magazine, called him the apostle to the skeptics. That his job was to call people to deal seriously with God, with Christ, but to say to them, from there's going to be further issues to deal with, but that's not really what I feel my calling is to sort of sort out for you or in dialogue with you. So Lewis himself would have said that mere Christianity was necessary but not sufficient.
Oh, very good. Yeah, that's a great way to clarify that. Now, I wanted to jump back over to what you were talking about, some of the different topics that you've addressed there that were Lewis's arguments that may have been unaddressed or poorly addressed by the new atheists. And one of them that you mentioned was the argument from desire. And as I'm familiar with this argument, but I'm familiar with the things that I've heard from atheists or skeptics, and this would be one where it seems to me it would be almost laughed at, where, what, God has to exist because you have a desire for him, it's sort of that sort of a response that you'd hear. This is just absurd. I can have a desire for ice cream, doesn't mean ice cream exists. That sort of a quick response that you might hear. So unpack that a bit, why the argument from desire should be considered a little bit more thoroughly, deeply, seriously.
Well, I think a good place to start is with that sort of ice cream response. And the argument depends upon saying there are different classes of desire that humans have, some of which are what we could call innate desires, and some of which are not. So the desire for ice cream is not an innate human desire, whereas the desire for sustenance or food is an innate human desire. So the fact that you desire the ice cream doesn't mean that it's going to be a fulfillable desire. You could have just, before the invention of ice cream, perhaps you're the first person you imagine such a thing, and you start desiring it, but that doesn't mean there is anywhere that you can get, okay? But the fact that you're hungry means there must be something that you can eat. It may not be ice cream, but there's something edible. And it's innate desires that the argument plays upon. It depends upon saying we have either an innate desire for God, or at least innate desires for things that those desires could only be satisfied on the precondition that God existed. And you can see then how that argument would tie into other arguments. For example, the moral argument, which we might talk about later. There's a bit of an overlap there, but it is crucial to see that the argument's talking about desires that we are sort of born into the world with, rather than that are artificially created or stimulated within us. And I think once you make that distinction, that gets around the whole, just because I want £1 million doesn't mean I'm going to get one sort of objection.
So what are the various innate desires, aside from sort of this desire for the transcendent or for God? What are some of the things that Lewis describes there being desires for that are therefore actually fulfillable? Can you list some of those and then show how the analogy works for belief or the existence of God? Well,
I think Lewis primarily focuses upon this desire for the transcendent and sort of puts the argument in a couple of different forms. One form he puts it in is a sort of negative form of saying, actually in life I found that I keep searching for something that will fulfill this desire for the transcendent, that I find this desire is sort of sparked within me by all sorts of things in life, but when I actually get those things, I find that they don't satisfy the desire. And he talks about this in his allegorical biographical book, The Pilgrim's Regress, as well, at some length. The various things that he's sort of pursued in life, thinking that will fulfill my nature, that'll make me happy, that'll sort of plug this sort of hole within me. And yet when getting those objects, apparent objects of desire, finding that they don't satisfy, and that they merely evoked this desire for something that yet stands sort of behind them. They're sort of signposts towards something more, something transcendent, to what the world around us can actually offer in terms of satisfaction for that desire. And says, well, you either end up taking a sort of a disenchanted view of the world that says it's all a sort of big joke at our expense, and we're born with this innate desire for fulfillment that the world will not give us. The world is, as the sort of French existentialist philosopher Camus would have said, absurd, in that there's this mismatch between our inbuilt desires and what the world will actually offer us as satisfactions. Or you can sort of incline to the sunnier metaphysical side and say, well, if the things around me in the world don't satisfy this desire, then perhaps there's something beyond the world that will satisfy it. So that's one of the main sort of streams of the way in which Lewis phrases it. The sort of process of existential search through life.
Yeah, well, and I suppose that those are the sorts of things that, as we would say, everyone feels or everyone senses or encounters, but it's easy because it's an experience to explain it away. Oh, well, if you believe, say, or if you accept naturalism already, it's easy to explain that away in naturalistic terms, but if you're approaching it objectively, maybe without a preconceived settling on naturalism as your end point or your starting point.
That's right. I think Lewis would say sort of that the straightforward interpretation, given that this is an innate desire, is that it has some satisfaction. In every other case where we find innate desires, we do find that there are satisfactions for them. So there's the desire for sustenance, there is food, there is the desire for continuing the species, there is sexual reproduction, there is the desire for liquid, there is liquid, and so on, and you can mount a sort of inferential case from that, which would at least sort of put the burden of proof on those who want to say, in this particular instance, that desire is going to be frustrated.
Well, that's good. And another one of the arguments there you mentioned was this argument from reason, which Lewis is quite popular for. And as I ask you this, I want to try to give our listeners an idea of the style in which you're writing your book, C.S. Lewis versus the New Atheists. And so explain how you approach it in the book from a sort of back and forth dialogue between Lewis and the New Atheists regarding this argument from reason. What is it? How do the New Atheists respond to it, and how is it answered by Lewis?
Right. So, this is getting much more sort of metaphysically abstract, and Lewis puts the argument in a number of ways in a number of different places, but what I pick up on is particularly the way in which Alvin Plantinga, probably known to a lot of listeners, in putting what's called his evolutionary anti-naturalism argument, Plantinga himself references back to C.S. Lewis's argument in Miracles and says, I'm making an argument very similar to the argument that Lewis made, and which a couple of other recent theistic philosophers have been defending, philosophers like Victor Reppert in his book C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea. And I explain Lewis's approach to the arguments and the way in which those arguments are being defended by contemporary philosophers of religion like Plantinga and Reppert, William Hasker, and then look at the moves that New Atheists make in responding or failing to respond or indeed even understand what that argument is. And I'm particularly helped there by the fact that, for example, Alvin Plantinga had a debate with Daniel Dennett on the evolutionary argument, and also that Paul Copan put to Richard Dawkins after one of his events, had a dialogue with Richard Dawkins about how Dawkins would respond to a version of the argument from reason, in which exchange, it became patently clear that Richard Dawkins had never actually heard of this argument and didn't really understand what it was, which I think in itself is telling.
A lot of times the new atheists are known for their rhetoric and for their style that they bring to sometimes old arguments for atheism. But I'm wondering, from an intellectual perspective and from an arguments perspective, do they have any new arguments that they bring to the table? And if so, does Lewis seem to already have an answer for them, or has he addressed this somehow in his writings?
Well, I think the new atheists can, of course, point to newer scientific understandings of reality. They can point to different sort of detail in some of the argument. But the actual structure of the arguments, or the philosophical approach to the arguments, is surprisingly similar, I should say, to the way in which the general sort of atheistic philosophical way of approaching things was back in Lewis's day. And particularly significant here, I think, is the figure of A.J. Ayer and the whole so-called logical positivist movement that Lewis himself didn't buy into. Even as an atheist, he didn't buy into what you might call sort of very narrow scientific approaches to knowledge or to the meaningfulness of religious claims. And it's actually, I think, this crucial difference that led Lewis to take arguments like the argument from reason seriously, in a way that the new atheists don't really bother interacting with it, because they have a prior commitment to very narrow scientific understanding of how you know things. That means that you don't really have to bother seriously considering philosophical arguments, because you don't really know things about reality through philosophical metaphysical arguments. You only really know things about reality through science for them. And so they have a sort of bias against philosophy in that sense, and are sort of entrapped within this sort of early 20th century sort of logical positivist almost view of knowledge, and that's a crucial difference between Lewis, even Lewis the atheist, and the so-called new atheists.
Well, Peter, considering that you wrote a book about atheism, which is The Skeptic's Guide to Atheism, and that delves deep into what atheists, especially new atheists, believe and argue, I wonder what you see happening with the new atheism these days and as it progresses. Do you see it to be on the rise or declining or holding steady?
Okay, well, A Skeptic's Guide to Atheism came out in, I think it was 2009, and that was basically after the first sort of tranche of new atheist books, which really clustered around sort of 2005, 2006, in Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion and Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, and so on. And we're certainly into a sort of a second, if not third, round of new atheist publishing now. And I think it is a law of diminishing returns settling in. The new atheists don't seem to be bothering to, in any serious manner, engage with their critics. Certainly a lot of critical responses to them have been published, and they don't seem to be sort of interacting with that and furthering any kind of dialogue on these issues, but rather beginning to sort of repeat themselves in a sense. I've kept up with the new atheist publishing and so on in this book, so I'm able to look at things like Sam Harris's attempt to subsume moral philosophy under science in his book The Moral Landscape, and look at that in detail in the chapter on the moral argument for God here, and basically agree with Lewis, who thought that David Hume was right to say there's no way of going from a descriptive is of reality to a prescriptive ought of morality. And Sam Harris tries and fails to get around that for exactly the reasons that Lewis would have given, quoting David Hume from several centuries before. So, you know, they do keep publishing. As I say, AC Grayling's just got this new book out that says it's you know, sort of the definitive refutation of reasons for believing in God. But having read most of it now, I find that he actually spends something like 28 pages looking at 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, arguments for God, and that the most recent work of natural theology that he references in the footnotes is from 1974. So that gives you some idea of the new atheists, because they have this sort of bias against serious engagement with metaphysics, because of this sort of scientistic attitude, aren't bothered to keep up with the dialogue in the world of philosophy of religion and apologetics, and are content to simply recycle their attitudes and their rhetoric, and content not to really engage with their critics. And so I would definitely say there's a law of diminishing returns setting in.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. And you're mentioning there how, you know, interacting with the more recent new atheist literature, you know, not the God delusion, you know, not still dealing with, you know, 2006 or whatever. But earlier you talked about, you know, the moral argument and what Sam Harris has been arguing. When we talked about that argument from desire, you mentioned how that sort of overlaps with the moral argument. So maybe unpack for a moment how those two arguments are overlapping and how you deal with them in the book.
Yes, well, certainly I think the existential issue of the sort of a desire for a meaningful existence, a desire for a valuable reality to be dedicated to pursuing. There are certainly some versions of the moral argument, Kant's version, for example, that focus on the issues about ultimate justice in reality if there is no sort of rhyme or reason or intrinsic purpose to reality and so on. Although I focus on the kind of moral argument that Lewis gives in Mere Christianity is along slightly different lines, is the argument about what kind of thing are objective moral values and what's the best explanation of their existence, where in the sort of furniture of one's worldview, as it were, can you best make an objective moral value at home, and arguing that the best place to make such a thing at home is within the mind or the character of God himself, because a moral value, if it's objective, if it's something we discover rather than that we invent, it's something that transcends individuals and groups and nations and so on. It transcends us. And yet, if it's a moral value, it's also something that prescribes our behavior, that obligates our behavior, that's an ideal. And all of those concepts just seem analytically bound to the concept of something personal. You can only be obligated to a person. You can't be obligated by your evolutionary history, say, happening to have given you the feeling that certain behaviors are taboo or to be avoided. You could appeal to evolution to explain the feeling that, but if you are asking the question, well, is that feeling correct or not, if it's actually true that you really should avoid certain actions, like a classic example, philosophers toss off these things, torturing small children for fun is wrong. If it's not merely the case that we feel bad about that, or we don't like that, but that we ought not to like that, we ought to avoid it, if this is a moral value that really tells us how we should behave, then the only way to explain that aspect of that moral value is to say that it's grounded in some personal reality that is rightly, has the right to authoritatively prescribe and obligate my behavior on the matter. And so the objective nature of morality puts it beyond finite persons, but the moral nature of that moral reality puts it outside of the category of any impersonal reality, and hence you're driven to some transcendent, objective, but personal and good reality, and that's beginning to sound a lot like what people mean by God.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and obviously you earlier mentioned a whole list of the different arguments that Lewis employs in his writings and unpacks in fuller measure, and many of which, as the goal of your book is, he engages with what the new atheists have. He's already answered the new atheists, so to speak.
Pre-answered them.
Yeah. So with that in mind, some people who know of Lewis, they're familiar maybe with him, his quote there where he talks about coming to Christianity kicking and screaming, where he wasn't a likely convert, so to speak. So I wonder about his journey. What were the things that were the key elements for him in his journey, would you say?
That's a fascinating issue, and that's something that I was fascinated to sort of trace through this book and through going back to Lewis's, not only his autobiography, but to his letters and so on. In part, of course, in the book, I'm keen to trace the influence of various arguments on him, but it's also interesting to see that those arguments had an impact on him in the context of his relationship with various people. Of a number of different sort of worldview and religious persuasions, indeed. But he was, at one and the same time, sort of pursuing this search that he describes in the Argument from Desire, that was sort of impelling him to search for something that would satisfy his inner longings. But he was committed at various stages to a materialistic worldview that said, everything that you sort of think is real is valueless and meaningless and purposeless, and the things that he thought were valuable were sort of unreal and in the realm of the imagination and poetry and so on. And a friend of his argued with him that this argument from reason showed that materialism was a self-contradictory worldview, and this pushed Lewis to embracing some kind of sort of idealistic Hegelian kind of worldview, and moved him away from materialism, but it didn't immediately drive him into theism at all. It was pushing him in that direction, and then the argument for morality is pushing more towards seeing the spiritual reality as a personal reality with authority, something that one is related to through the moral law. And then Lewis also then began to explore the historical case for Jesus, and had a conversation with a skeptic called Harry Weldon, who came into his rooms one day in college, and they got to talking about James Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, that was the first book that put this theory that sort of the Jesus, the Gospels were just a sort of another dying and rising God myth, which is an idea that's actually now fallen out of academic favour, but had only just been sort of put into the academic world back then. But Harry Weldon said to Lewis, this rum thing, this idea of Fraser's about the dying and rising God, it almost looks as if it happened for real once. And this sort of really shook Lewis, because he felt if this really sceptical colleague of his thought that the historical evidence was actually quite good for Jesus, this was something he ought to investigate. And as someone who's got a background in classical pagan literature and mythology and so on, Lewis, looking at the Gospels, recognized that these Gospels were not the same thing. They were not myths in the sense of not being historical, but they were. He came to the view famously of calling them true myths, that God expressed himself in the incarnation in a sort of mythological manner in order to communicate with the human way of understanding these things, the human mind, but that the Gospels had this crucial difference, that they were true as well, that this wasn't just, some dying and rising seasonal God who died who knows where in a sort of Never Land, but, he says under Pontius Pilate on a certain, in a certain historical context with names and dates and people saying, we really saw this, and being prepared to martyr themselves for that claim and so on. So it's a sort of conspiracy of accumulating arguments and investigations and relationships with a range of people, actively discussing these issues and being prepared to take philosophical arguments seriously, and as the motto of the Socratic Club that Lewis was the president of said, being prepared to follow the evidence wherever it went.
Fascinating little glimpse into the life of Lewis there, and there's more in your book, obviously. For many Christian apologists, they've maybe delved into Lewis's writings. They may have read Mere Christianity, and they may be hugely affected by it, and then they've gone on to read more of his other works. But for those who have not maybe explored the wealth of his writings, Peter, where would you suggest someone start when they're looking at the writings of Lewis?
Well, probably Mere Christianity is the most famous of his sort of apologetical works, although it's mainly sort of apologetical at the beginning. It's a collection of radio talks and a collection of 3 separately published books that then got put together as one. And the latter part is more sort of an attempt to understand and communicate sort of basic Christian theology rather than being particularly apologetic in nature. I think a really good place to go for the apologetics of Lewis is to get a collection of Lewis's essays. There's a book called C.S. Lewis Essay Collection, Faith, Christianity and the Church, published by HarperCollins, which collects all of his essays that are sort of apologetical and philosophical in nature, and that's a really good place to go to and sort of dip in and out of. His most sort of philosophical work is probably Miracles, and I think that's well worth reading, particularly given the contemporary debate about the argument from reason there. That's good background for that. And his little lectures on the abolition of man, a very influential little book of Lewis's, praised by philosophers today for its engagement with issues about sort of relativism and morality, and very relevant to the debate about sort of the human improvement movement, sort of eugenic movement and so on. So, and Too Little Red, I think. So that's a very important book of Lewis's, The Abolition of Man. So maybe those are a couple of places to go to.
Well, great. Thanks for that, Peter. Now, I know, from reading your book, The Skeptic's Guide to Atheism, one of the things that struck me about that book was, wow, the amount of research you've did and all of the things that you've explored through the works of the new atheists to really delve into that book. And there's so much depth to your work that you put into your writings. And I know that anyone reading this book about Lewis, they're going to find that same sort of thing where you're completely familiar with all the vast work of Lewis, and then you're able to bring that to bear on the new atheists. It's really something I would want to recommend to people. So I want to point them your way. If someone wants to find your resources and your book, Peter, where do you want to point them online?
Sure. Well, the book is available on all good online resellers. You can get it from Amazon.com.co.uk, etc. And you can find lots about me if you simply Google Peter S. Williams, There's a couple of Peter Williamses in the world of apologetics, so it's important to put the S in there. And you'll find lots of things. I've got a podcast channel that's available on iTunes, just called Peter S. Williams Podcast Channel, and you can get that through the Damaris Trust website as well. I work with the Damaris Trust in the UK as their philosopher in residence. I've got a page up there. There's a blog. I'm even on Twitter these days, so there's plenty of places you can find me, but Googling is a swift way to get a lot of different results.
Oh, great. Well, I'll link to your resources and the blog. Thanks again, Peter, for doing the interview, and great talking with you again. Keep up the good work.
Marvelous. Thanks very much, Brian.
I've been speaking with Christian philosopher, apologist, and author Peter S. Williams. Check out links to his books and resources at today's blog post at Apologetics 315. I want to thank those who have been supporting Apologetics 315 through their financial gifts, and also for those who use our Amazon affiliate links located at the right-hand side of apologetics315.com. When you do your normal shopping from Amazon, using those links allows a small portion of your purchase to support what we're doing, and it only costs you a click. Those links can be bookmarked for ease of use whenever you shop online. We continue to transcribe these interviews with the help of volunteer transcribers and donations. And if you'd like to help with more, just email me at interviews@apologetics315.com. We're also still interested in developing an iPhone or Android app for Apologetics 315. However, we're looking for developers or funders for this project. So if you're interested in seeing this project take off, you can contact me at brian@apologetics315.com. If you enjoyed this interview, please consider sharing it on Twitter or Facebook. This helps get the word out about good apologetics resources, so please share it with a friend today. If you have suggestions for the interviews, you can email me at interviews@apologetics315.com. This is Brian Oughton, and thanks again for listening.